I welcome you all to this week's session of the Workshop in the History of Material Texts, which is now in its astounding 27th year. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm one of the co-organizers of the workshop. I'm let's say, the representative from the University of Pennsylvania Press, where I'm the humanities editor and where I work on the material text book series that is coordinated with this workshop. I'd like to introduce also Zach Lesser, who is our faculty director.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again.
John Pollock, our opposite number from the Kislak Center.
Behind me. Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Philip Mogan, the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, without whom we would all have a bumpy ride. So,
hi, everyone.
Yeah. And then last but certainly never least, the person without whom none of this would be possible and whom we're so very happy to see returning after a few weeks hiatus, Peter Stallybrass, our founding director.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, there's Peter. And the man of the week this week, Simcha Gross. So I'm really delighted that we're able to welcome Simcha to present. Simcha was educated at Yeshiva University, where he took his undergraduate degree and a first master's in Talmud studies. From there, he went on to Yale, where he earned his master's and doctorate in religious studies. He's taught at Stanford and UC Irvine. At Irvine, he was assistant professor of history from 2017 to 2019. And he came to Penn in the fall of 2019. So a little bit more than a year ago, although of course it seems like it was another lifetime. So Simcha is an assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations here at Penn, and he's also the co-director of the Philadelphia Seminar on Christian Origins. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Ancient Judaism, the Jewish Studies Quarterly, in the Jewish Quarterly Review, among other places. And he is editor and translator with Aaron Michael Butts of The History of the Slave of Christ, which he characterizes as the only Syriac martyr text about a Jewish boy who converts to Christianity. This was published by Gorgias Press in 2016. He's also the co-editor, along again with Aaron Michael Butts, of Jews and Syriac Christianity, Intersections Across the First Millennium, which was published just this year by Mor Siebeck. While we await completion of his monograph on Babylonian Jewish culture under Sasanian rule, we benefit from his presence as a colleague in myriad ways. I, for one, as the happy beneficiary of his advice on Israeli television series and Where to Go Antiquing in the Catskills. So it's with tremendous pleasure to welcome Simcha this evening, and he will be presenting on Whoever is Hungry, Come and Eat, on the origins and winding reception of a puzzling Passover passage. So Simcha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for the lovely introduction, for being so welcoming since we arrived in the antediluvian period. I want to thank Zach, Philip, Peter, and John for hosting this wonderful seminar and for including me this year. I hope this is up and running. Okay, good. The recitation of the Passover Haggadah, the main liturgical component of the Passover Seder, or ritual meal, continues to be one of the most enduring, widespread, and recognizable Jewish practices. According to a 2014 Pew Research survey, though only 23% of American Jews regularly attend religious services monthly, 70% participate in Passover Seders, including 40% who identify as having no religion. In recent years, much to the chagrin of many church officials, there has been an increase in Christian Seders intended to mimic Jesus's final supper, commonly conceived as a Passover Seder. The Haggadah's popularity is not new. Its primary theme of the transition from servitude to freedom, from poverty to wealth, resonated with Jewish communities for centuries, who have left us with an abundance and rich diversity of Haggadot from the Middle Ages to the present, in the form of manuscripts, printed editions, and even mass-produced Maxwell House coffee Haggadot. Paradoxically, the Haggadah's popularity has also rendered it an exceedingly misunderstood and enigmatic document. Over the centuries of its recitation and use, Jewish communities have added and amended and altered the Haggadah to reflect their own cultural milieus. As new elements were added to the Haggadah, they were transmitted to other Jewish communities, who often assumed they reflected age-old practices and frequently offered new interpretations for what originated as local customs. Indeed, the very practice of reciting a standardized Haggadah on Passover is often assumed to be an age-old Jewish practice. However, scholars now accept that the notion that Passover evenings should be spent reciting a standardized text is an innovation of Jews following the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 CE, when sacrifice, the primary ritual component of Passover up to that point, was no longer possible. The Haggadah is therefore a paradigm of the way traditions are in a continual process of formation, change, and development as they travel across time and space, encountering new actors and cultural milieus. It is also a particularly rich example of the complicated, centuries-long process of compilation and transmission of certain kinds of ancient texts and many ancient Jewish texts that do not fit our modern conceptions of the production and dissemination of clearly demarcated and completed works. Today, I will focus on the opening of the Passover Haggadah. Though often assumed to date back well into antiquity, I will show that it arose in late antique Babylonia, roughly central Iraq, but was originally entirely unrelated to Passover or Jewish ritual. We will travel from the two major centers of Jewish learning in late antiquity, Palestine and Babylonia, to North Africa in the early Middle Ages, and then to medieval and early modern Europe, as Babylonian rabbinic teaching and practice grew in prominence and spread rapidly across the world. We will thus trace how a local custom became a widely transmitted ritual act and text, shaping and being shaped by various communities that received and in turn transmitted it yet further with unanticipated and even surprising results. The Haggadah opens with the following invitation. This is the bread of affliction that our parents ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and partake of the Passover. This year we are here, next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we will be freed men. Though it has become naturalized through centuries of repetition, the opening invitation is unusual relative to the rest of the Haggadah in several ways. Whereas most of the Haggadah clearly derives from or is comprised of citations of the Bible and earlier rabbinic literature, the opening of the Haggadah lacks any overt basis in earlier Jewish sources. Unlike the rest of the Haggadah, which is composed in Hebrew, these lines are in Aramaic. Lastly, the prominent position of this passage at the outset of the Haggadah requires explanation. Focusing especially on the invitation in the second sentence, traditional interpreters and modern scholars alike have offered sundry and dramatically different explanations for the provenance of this section, its placement and purpose, and the reason it is in Aramaic. Some have argued that this passage emerged while the temple in Jerusalem still stood, and indeed that Jesus hinted at it when he said, according to the Gospel of John, quote, "I am the bread of life, whoever comes to me shall not hunger." According to others, by contrast, the opening of the Haggadah was intended as anti-Christian polemic, a response to verses like that in John or to the practice of the Eucharist. In an entirely different vein, some traditional interpreters argue that the invitation was intended to ward off demons. Little evidence has come to light to resolve these disparate interpretations, nor to elucidate how and why this passage and its attending practices generated such a rich and diverse commentarial tradition. Our earliest evidence for the inclusion of the opening invitation in the recitation of the Passover Haggadah is in the works of Babylonian Jewish scholars known as Geonim, the heads of rabbinic academies in early medieval Iraq, flourishing approximately between the 8th through 11th centuries. One of these rabbis, named Rav Matitya, who died in 869 CE, offers a very telling description of the opening passage of the Haggadah, and here I'm reading. Quote, "Regarding that which we recite, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and perform the Passover. This was the custom of our fathers. They would not close their doors, and their neighbors were Jews, and they would recite the invitation so that they would receive spiritual reward. But now that our non-Jewish neighbors are Gentiles, or rather now that our neighbors are Gentiles, we support the poor earlier so that they do not wander the entrances searching for charity, and then we recite the invitation like the custom of the first ones." Rav Matityahu first notes that the recitation of the invitation was accompanied by a practice to open the door. The formula and practice were a minhag avot, an ancestral custom, rather than an established component of the Passover Seder ritual. Jews conducting the Passover Seder would leave the doors of their home open and recite the invitation formula in order to invite poor Jewish neighbors to join them. Rav Matityahu is clear that the custom was a genuine attempt to support the poor by making an explicit invitation and leaving the door open. By doing so, the host merited divine reward. However, Rav Matityahu proceeds to describe how this practice transitioned from a social custom to a formalized ritual. According to him, due to changing demographics, non-Jews outnumbered Jews in formerly Jewish majority neighborhoods. As a result, the custom was changed so that indigent Jews were funded before the Passover Seder to prevent them from wandering door to door and presumably from excessively interacting with non-Jews. Despite the fact that the raison d'etre of the invitation had become obsolete, Rav Matityahu notes that the practice remained unchanged. The invitation was still recited, but now as a formal component of the Haggadah rather than for the poor to hear. By the 9th century in Jewish Babylonia, then, there was a custom to recite the invitation and open the door at the outset of the Haggadah. According to Rav Matityahu, this practice was, however, already undergoing change. Yet precisely when this practice originated and entered the Haggadah remains uncertain. Particularly when Rav Matityahu refers to the custom of our fathers, is he referring to his immediate ancestors or to ancestors in the distant Jewish past? A solution to the origins of this practice is made possible by a number of documents discovered in the Cairo Geniza in the late 20th century. Scholars realized that an early medieval manuscript discovered in the Cairo Geniza, now in the collection of none other than the University of Pennsylvania at the Katz Center and known as Helper 211, preserves an early and different version of the Haggadah than the one that would become standard across the Jewish world. As these scholars argued, Helper 211 represented the Haggadah according to the early medieval Palestinian tradition rather than Babylonian. Another manuscript preserving this tradition was soon identified in the collection of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. One of the noteworthy features that distinguishes these Palestinian Haggadahs from the Babylonian is the absence of the opening invitation. Therefore, when Rav Matityahu, the Babylonian Academy head, said that the custom to open one's door and recite the invitation dates to his ancestors, he appears to have meant his local Babylonian ancestors in the rather recent rather than distant past. The passage and its addition to the Passover Haggadah can therefore only be understood by contextualizing it within late antique Jewish Babylonia. And in fact, earlier Babylonian Jewish texts dating from roughly the 4th through 6th century CE contain a number of close parallels to the invitation formula. Two such parallels are found in the Babylonian Talmud, a work with a long compilation history of its own, but which appears to have been mainly redacted in the 6th century CE. Both stories appear in context entirely unrelated to Passover or Jewish festivals. In the first story, two 4th century rabbis discuss the exceptional deeds of the 3rd century rabbi Rav Huna, and particularly how he generously dispensed of his considerable wealth. These rabbis report that, quote, when Rav Huna would eat a meal, he would open the door and say, "Whoever is in need, come and take." Others added, when Rav Huna learned of a medical remedy, he would draw a pitcher, hang it up and say, "Whoever is in need, come and take, so as not to be endangered." The resemblance between the invitation in the Haggadah and the story of Rav Huna is striking. Beyond the near verbatim invitation, in both the Haggadah and Talmudic story, the inviter also opens their door. Yet the relationship between the two passages is unclear. Rav Huna opens his door and invites people to partake of his goods, both food and other items like medicine, not in the context of a festival or a required formalized ritual. How then did the Passover Haggadah come to share this practice? A direct genealogical connection between the two passages, for instance, Rav Huna's generous practice serving as a model for the Haggadah, does not explain why this practice in particular, and not the many other supererogatory deeds attributed to pious rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud, was selected for emulation. Nor does it explain why it came to be included in the Passover Haggadah rather than in any other Jewish ritual or festival. Another striking parallel is found in an additional story in the Babylonian Talmud. This story has often been neglected, perhaps because key components are absent from the commonly used printed editions of the Talmud. However, these details are attested in the best early medieval manuscripts. In the version of these stories preserved in these manuscripts, one rabbi asks another why he sighed at the sight of the entrance of the now abandoned home of Rav Chana bar Chanilai, a 3rd century Babylonian rabbi. The sighing rabbi explains that Rav Chana, too, was exceedingly wealthy and his household was incredibly generous. His munificent deeds include the fact that the house had 4 doors opening on different sides, and whoever went in hungry went out full. Additionally, quote, they would put out baskets of bread and dates and say, whoever is hungry, come and eat. The 2 stories in the Babylonian Talmud therefore share much in common. Both feature the generosity of a wealthy rabbi made manifest by, among other things, nearly identically phrased invitations. And both entail charity located in particular around the doorways of the home. Alongside the 2 stories in the Babylonian Talmud, the invitation formula is also attested among the fascinating Aramaic incantation bowls. This massive corpus of over 2,000 ceramic bowls was discovered in various sites across Iraq and dates to the 6th through 7th century CE. The incantations on the bowls were composed in Syriac, Mandaic, and most numerously in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. These bowls were positioned at the entrance to the home or to the rooms within it, and were primarily intended to ward off demons and malevolent forces responsible for illness and other deleterious circumstances, which are often depicted on the bowls themselves. Incidentally, the first major scholarly publication of these bowls was produced by the Penn Museum in 1913, which holds hundreds of bowl specimens from archaeological digs in the ancient Babylonian city of Nippur, conducted in the 2nd half of the 20th century. The incantations on the bowls, which are quite diverse, provide our only literary evidence for the Jews of Babylonia during this period, with the exception of the Babylonian Talmud. In a number of these Jewish Babylonian incantations, malevolent forces marshal at the doors of the house of those seeking protection. In response, those seeking protection climb to the roof of the house and issue an invitation to the demonic malevolent forces at their door, offering for them to partake of their goods or to depart, using the invitation formula, quote, why have you come, O evil sorceries and upsetting mysteries? If you are hungry, come and eat. If you are thirsty, come and drink. If you are dry, come and be anointed. The invitation appears to disarm the malevolent forces by setting the terms of their entry into the house, apart from which they must return from whence they came. The invitation is publicized from the rooftop, meant to grab the attention of those forces around the doors of the home. While the wealth of those seeking protection is not clear from the incantation bowls, here too we find the needy, albeit malevolent and non-human, at the doors of Jewish homes, and a clearly articulated and identically phrased invitation for them to enter and satisfy themselves with the goods therein. The stories in the Babylonian Talmud and the scenes attested on the bowls situate the invitation in the context of the household doorway as a genuine attempt to welcome and nourish passers-by in need, whether human or other. And while the 2 rabbis open their doors, in the case of the bowls, the door must necessarily remain shut, keeping the malevolent forces at bay as the invitation is publicized instead from the rooftop. The appearance of the invitation in all of these texts mitigates against any simplistic genealogical relationship between them. Rather than originate in any given text, each of these sources attests the a priori and independent existence of this invitation, intended for the haves to invite and provide for the have-nots. Indeed, there remain differences between the texts, especially in terms of the goods the poor are invited to enjoy, whether medicine, food and drink, oil, or the Passover meal. Instead, each of these sources attest a recognized social script in which the elite would recite a similar formulaic invitation and physically welcome their guests to partake of their goods. This 2-part practice, the verbal invitation and physical welcome, was realized in the Passover Haggadah as an invitation issued with an open door. If the invitation and open door in the Passover Haggadah is an iteration of a local Babylonian Jewish social script, how and why did a custom develop to include this invitation in the Haggadah in the first place? I suggest the core theme of the Passover Haggadah, the obligation for participants to play act the transition of the ancient Israelites in their exodus from Egypt, from slavery to freedom, from poverty to wealth, was expressed by Babylonian Jews through a local social script commonly associated with the wealthy to open the door and invite the poor to enter. That is, when thinking about acting like the wealthy on Passover, Babylonian Jews naturally did so according to their local cultural expectations. The obligation to play act the transition from slavery to freedom is already apparent in the earliest description of the Passover Haggadah in the early 3rd century Mishnah, the earliest rabbinic text compiled in Roman Palestine. According to the Mishnah, everyone, both rich and poor, had to behave on Passover as if they were wealthy, for instance, by reclining while drinking and eating. As one early rabbi explained, reclining was itself a form of play acting because, quote, the general manner of slaves is to eat standing, but here one eats reclining, to convey that they have left slavery for freedom. Scholars have long noted that the manner in which the transition from slavery to freedom was realized in the earliest iterations of the Haggadah in the Mishnah and other Palestinian rabbinic texts was conditioned by the culturally prevalent forms of elite banqueting in Roman Palestine. From the organization of the meal to its many particular features, elite Greek and Roman habits shaped the Passover meal and Haggadah. Indeed, reclining itself was a prominent feature of Greek symposia and Roman convivia meals, other aspects of which are also on display in the Passover Haggadah, which even includes some telling Greek words. Jewish notions of the performance of wealth and freedom expressed in the Passover Haggadah were conditioned by their prevailing cultural context. Against this background, it is understandable how a custom developed among Babylonian Jews in which a specifically Babylonian expression of wealth was incorporated into the performance of Passover evening, playing on the themes of wealth and freedom. Indeed, this theme is explicitly invoked in the other line of the invitation. This year we are slaves, next year we will be freedmen. The issued invitation, however, was not simply lip service, but a social act with all of its attending expectations and obligations. The invitation was therefore in Aramaic, the spoken language of the time, so that it would be comprehensible to the invitees, and the doors to the house remained open so that they could enter. And it was placed at the beginning of the evening when the meal was formally begun in order to invite those in need to genuinely partake. The Babylonian Talmud, Aramaic Incantation Bowls, and Passover Haggadah each attest a recognized Babylonian social script in which the wealthy invited the poor to dine and partake of other essential needs. This script did not originate in any individual source, nor are the sources genealogically connected. Instead, each incorporates a pre-existing Babylonian social script for its own ends, to extol meritorious wealthy rabbis, to simultaneously invite and fend off malevolent demonic forces, and to perform the practices of a wealthy freeman on Passover. Taken together, these sources offer an intriguing window into Babylonian Jewish social realia and the way social scripts came to inform Babylonian Jewish practice and ritual. By understanding the original social setting of the invitation, the catalyst for the changes reported by Rav Matitya, with which we began, are thrown into sharper relief. Rav Matitya suggests that Jews in the past lived primarily in settlements or neighborhoods predominantly populated by other Jews, for which we have some corroborating evidence. In such a context, an open invitation to the Jewish poor worked well. Yet Rav Matitya relates that as these demographic conditions shifted and non-Jews came to outnumber Jews locally, the previous practice was no longer tenable. Instead, support for the poor was transformed from an ad hoc individualized invitation to an institutionalized practice of communal charity prior to the Passover evening. These changes limited the encounters between the Jewish needy and non-Jews and the risk of the former dining or socializing with the latter. Rav Matitya's appeal to a demographic shift to explain the transition coheres with the well-attested relocation of Jews from the Babylonian countryside to urban centers and other lands in the 9th and 10th centuries under Islamic rule. Despite these momentous demographic changes, Rav Matitya informs us that he and his followers did not jettison the custom entirely. An invitation meant to reach the poor was, instead, preserved as a ritual and textual act, an utterance recited by and for the meal participants alone. It is important to note that Rav Matitya's approach was by no means inevitable. Some evidence exists that suggests that while Rav Matitya and other Babylonian Jews may have preserved the invitation despite the changing circumstances, others apparently eliminated it once its raison d'etre had been obviated. Nevertheless, Rav Matitya's opinion would prevail and the invitation would become a central component of the Haggadah precisely at the moment when Babylonian Jewish traditions, authority, and texts spread across the Jewish world beginning in the early medieval period. As the Babylonian Jewish Haggadah with the opening invitation reached other Jewish communities, commentators and practitioners sought to understand the bases for the practices therein, especially those portions with no clear basis in earlier rabbinic traditions. In the case of the opening invitation, without communal memory of the Babylonian Jewish social milieu in which it arose, these later commentators often struggled to understand its purpose and intent. An early anonymous and influential commentary on the Haggadah exclaims bewilderedly about the invitation, quote, "And does every man open their entrance and declare, whoever is hungry, come and eat?" Instead, the commentary suggests that the invitation was directed to those already participating in the meal, who were ravenous after a long day waiting to eat. Others suggested that given its oddity, the purpose of the invitation was to elicit questions from children, a feature of other aspects of the Haggadah. More intriguingly, later Jews also preserved the accompanying practice to open the door. Yet whereas the door was originally opened to invite the poor into one's home, in time other ideologies were proffered, which would themselves shape the later reception of this practice. Most influential was a statement attributed to the 11th century North African rabbi Nissim Bar Yaakov, whose family shared particularly intimate ties with the Babylonian rabbis. He reports that on Passover evening, his father would, quote, "not close the doors to his house that we dwell in at all. And from that time until now, this is our custom, and the doors of the house remain open, so that when Elijah comes, we will go out to greet him speedily without delay." According to this source, some Jews in North Africa continued to leave the doors of their home open on Passover evening. However, this was now assigned a new meaning to express their preparedness to go out and join the prophet Elijah. This explanation was based on earlier rabbinic sources that suggested that Passover evening would, on some future date, usher in the Messianic era in which Elijah was thought to play a critical role. Without knowledge of the original social context, Nissim is forced to appeal to earlier rabbinic literature and Jewish thought to rationalize a later practice. Nissim Bar Yaakov is the earliest evidence that the practice to open one's door was disaggregated from the invitation and treated as a distinct ritual act, receiving an entirely new ideology as a sign of faith in God's promise of salvation. His explanation, in turn, would become widely accepted, leading to still greater disconnect between the original purpose of the open door and its later development. Thus, according to the late 12th century Provençal rabbi Avraham ben Natan Hayarchi, to express hope of redemption on Passover evening, it was no longer the doors of the house that had to be unlocked, but instead the bedroom doors. The association with the poor in the streets is here entirely attenuated. Given that the open door was no longer associated with the invitation, but with the anticipation of the arrival of the Messiah, some traditions relocated the open door to the end of the Passover meal, rather than its beginning, near the fourth and final cup of wine. Already in rabbinic literature, the fourth cup symbolized the final stage of salvation. At this point in the meal, some communities, beginning in the 11th century, began to recite a prayer for the speedy destruction of Israel's enemies, known as, quote, "pour out your wrath on the nations." Over time, these two practices signifying the salvation anticipated on Passover, the open doors, and the prayer during the final cup, merged. Whereas the earliest illustrated Haggadot from the 13th century lack depictions of Elijah and the Messiah, by the 15th century, German and German-influenced illustrated Haggadot similarly begin to depict either the Messiah or the Messiah and Elijah at the fourth cup of the meal, a practice which soon spread to other regional Haggadot. Some sources from the early 16th century even describe a new practice, attested in subsequent sources as well, of a participant dressing up as Elijah and entering through the open door, mimicking Elijah's much anticipated arrival. Others even suggested that the meal participants should issue an invitation to Elijah and the Messiah from the open door, which read, "Elijah and the Messiah enter." Here we have a kind of modified return of the repressed. The open door at the beginning of the meal, originally intended to invite the poor and signify the transition from poverty to wealth, was relocated to the end of the meal, intended to invite Elijah and signify the coming of salvation. Lastly, as the association between the open door, Elijah's arrival, and the fourth and final cup was solidified, one other practice emerged, known as the cup of Elijah. Until this day, Jews pour an extra cup of wine for Elijah under the belief that he visits every house right after the fourth cup of wine is consumed. First attested in the 15th century in illuminated Haggadot, the first textual description of it is offered by the 15th century German rabbi Zelinkman Binga, who remarks that the practice is of recent vintage and its explanation unknown to him, though he too connects it with the expectation of Elijah's arrival on Passover evening. Paradoxically then, as the custom drifted further from its original social context, it regained some of its initial purpose. However, instead of inviting the poor, this tradition invited Elijah the prophet to enter and even to partake of wine. Each of these later developments no doubt had its own contextual stimulus, but all emerged as a result of the displacement of an originally late antique Jewish Babylonian social practice. To summarize, the Passover Haggadah's opening invitation and attending practices emerged from a late antique Babylonian Jewish context in which they were part of a recognizable social script of charity and generosity. They reflect how Babylonian Jews realized the themes of wealth and poverty that are emphasized throughout Passover evening through a local social script also attested in multiple Babylonian rabbinic sources and Aramaic incantation bowls. In turn, social and demographic changes in Babylonia led to a formalization of these practices into rituals inconsistent with their original intent. As these practices became further chronologically and geographically removed from late antique Babylonia, they received new ideologies and correlated practices. The Haggadah's continued development serves as a test case for the long and winding history of Jewish practices and texts as they grow untethered from the setting in which they were originally culturally legible and are transmitted to new context and realized afresh by new actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simcha. That was wonderful and fascinating and enlightening and great. And the floor is now open for questions and discussion. What we ask is that everybody use the raise hand function in the chat, and I will call on people in the order in which they've asked. If I can just get my chat visible. Please raise your hands.
I think Natalie has a question.
There's Natalie. Okay. All right, Natalie.
I still don't know how to raise my hands in Zoom.
Okay.
9 months later. I'll just raise my actual hand. Simcha, thank you. I really loved that talk. It was fantastic. I have one question about the original citation from Rav Matjak. Could we look at it again? I just wanted to see if I followed your reading on it. Because my question has a little bit to do with the culture of charity. And let's see.
I'm pulling it up.
Basically, it says, as I saw it, now that there are Gentiles all around us, we make sure they're not hungry before Passover because we don't want them hanging around our doors. And that's how I'm reading it. But you read it as, now that there are Gentiles all around us, we give a lot of charity to Jews at other times. So because that's how we take care of our charity obligations, right?
I think both of our readings are the same. That is, now that there are many non-Jews living here, this practice is non-tenable, and yet we still want to be charitable. So we've basically modified the practice to become an institutionalized, preemptive charity rather than wait for the night of.
Well, I think what it says is, I think what it might say is, we still want to be charitable, but Davka, we do not want to be charitable to Gentiles. So when we open our door and say, come eat in our Gentile neighborhood, oh my God, Mr. Smith's going to come, and we don't want to feed him on Passover. So I think I just was asking, one, if that's probably a reading of that text, and two, if you can map this change on different cultures of charity in these various contexts. And then my other question had to do with, of course, is the low-hanging fruit raised by your bowls. But is there, since there's obviously this whole other door tradition connected with Passover, I wonder if there's other apotropaic components that are also weaving through You don't mention the obvious door reference here. But anyway, I really liked the story you told, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question. In terms of your reading of the second half of Rav Matitya, I think it's plausible. I have no problem with it. All I would say is what he adds is so that they do not wander the entrances. And I think syntactically that has to refer to the Jewish poor and not the non-Jewish poor. I can send you the original Aramaic, which you can read as well as I can, and we can debate it. But if I remember correctly, I think the syntax suggests that it's actually referring to the non-Jewish poor. I'm not sure if that's decisive in which one of our readings is right.
Because the antecedent of them is Gentiles. We support them. We feed our neighbors, so they leave us alone.
We support them earlier, that is the Jewish poor, so that they do not wander entrances, that is the Jewish poor.
I don't see the Jewish poor here.
It's the they.
Anyway, I can look. I'll look at it. I'll look at the passage. But
in any event, in terms of the second question, which is a great one in terms of kind of late antique charity practices, what I would say is that from around roughly the same period in medieval Islamic sources, from the Geniza and so on, so from Cairo and North Africa, it seems that there's actually, and Mark Cohen from Princeton has written about this, there seems to be an aversion particularly to wandering mendicants, those people who are going door to door and asking for money. There's an actual aversion, and people do their best to basically subvert that practice. So in that way, it seems a distinctly Babylonian kind of charitable expression. The one thing I would add is I have not found any other texts from Babylonia, primarily Syriac and Pahlavi or Middle Persian, that have this same, at least I haven't found it yet, the same kind of open door with a very similar formula. And again, in terms of incantation bowls, there are all sorts of parallels that travel. In terms of dialect of Aramaic, Syriac is almost identical to Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, as is Mandaic. They're both, all three of them are Eastern Aramaic dialects. And I still haven't found it. That could be because we have no real useful search engines or haven't read enough. But thus, it would help my case if I was able to argue this isn't just Jewish, it's just Babylonian, but I haven't yet been able to find anything to prove that.
Okay, we have a question from Talia Fishman.
Simcha, this was terrific. What a wonderful chronological and geographic span, and how you've shown interrelationships. I just really ate it all up. I was hungry and I came and ate. I have dumb questions. The first, well, one dumb question, and then I'd like to see the source from Seligman of Binga. But the dumb question is the following. You explained how the practice of opening the door was shifted toward the latter end of the Passover Seder and connected with the welcoming of Elijah. My question has to do with the fact that the door is opened when Jews are reciting a really nasty, vindictive prayer, and how scary it must have been to be opening the door as you're bringing down, your imprecations. You're asking for terrible things to happen to your neighbors, and you're shouting it in their faces. I don't get that. I understand why you would open it for Elijah, but I don't understand why you open it. I mean, are you trying to say, I'm stronger than this, I have faith?
It's a great question. I think the way I would think about it is once the practices merged, so these are all one expression of hope and salvation, and therefore because you must open the door, and Elijah is going to come in and usher in the Messianic period in which he will, of course, according to this prayer, pour out his wrath on the nations, they all come as a package. That's the best that I can do. I agree with you that it's, sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to say, it's so far from what the Gaonic, what Rabbeinu Nisim of 11th century Cairo said. He's just saying, we open it so that Elijah can come in, but this is really taunting, in my opinion.
I think in some ways it reflects changing notions of salvation. That is, North African and European Jews, in this case, the prayer seems to have arisen in France around the time of the First Crusades. At least that's one of the major theories. It seems that they have distinct notions of salvation and how pleasant a day it would be versus how fire and brimstone a day it might be. But you know, in terms of how logical it is, I don't know, but that's what I think is happening here.
Good, thank you. Would you mind showing us the words of Rabbi Seligman of Binga?
I don't have them on the slide, but I have them
Okay.
in the paper, which this will
I'll be
eventually
happy
be
to read.
based on, and I can either send it to you or pull it up as we wait for the next question.
That's fine. Go on to the next question.
Okay. The next question seems to be from Liliana.
Simcha, thank you so much. How wonderful. Let me ask a very naive question. You know, traditionally, one would call the Jews the people of the book. And Simcha Gross calls it the people of the ritual and social practice. And I would like to push a little bit of, you know, towards the relationship between the practice and the written text. In some of the examples, you read the text as the kind of document that tells about a practice. Then it turns around and becomes a question of interpretation and commentary. And to some extent, it reminds me of kind of Derrida's situation of the belatedness. Is the word or the oral what's first? And I wonder whether you can say something about social ritual and textual documentation, because this is the history of material text.
I would say that part of what I think we have a problem with language, which is our language is developed to simplify what are very complicated processes in which transmission and composition are not distinct. Talia has a whole book about this, about the Babylonian Talmud, which is originally an oral document. As an oral document, of course, you can have synonymous changes. So every recitation, every performance can change the text, and yet over time, it also becomes standardized, formalized, and yet it's still open to change and flexible and so on. So I completely agree that these are somewhat simplified categories that we have to work with. In this case, I do think part of what's happening is that by it being transmitted, this practice that I see arising in Babylonia, once it is transmitted outside of its geographical and cultural context where it makes sense, where it is legible, it is formalized in a way in which you must now keep this invitation. As I mentioned, I hinted at, but there are actual very early Gaonic, that is medieval Iraqi fragments, which suggest that some people eliminated the opening invitation. They simply no longer had it. And I assume that's because they simply thought, well, now that we're not inviting the poor into our homes anymore, what's the point? But once it's transmitted out in textual form, in some kind of a solidified form, I think it becomes formalized such that you must have the recitation of the invitation, and you must have the opening of the door with which it's associated, even as those two things change and their symbolism changes, the meaning changes, and so on. So there's absolutely a process by which the textualization of these traditions, these social practices, solidifies them and formalizes them, and thus, let's just say, circumscribes the kinds of changes and innovation you might see, if that's fair. I don't know if it's Derridian, but I hope it's a decent explanation.
Okay. Peter Stallybrass.
Thanks, Simcha. That was really a fabulous talk, just great. I have sort of two questions, one of which is that they're sort of almost antithetical. The first comes from a talk that Daniel Uter gave, where he was thinking about actual doors. So part of what he opened up was what difference does the kind of door make? He was thinking specifically of Luther and the doors of churches, but he's written much more widely about doors. And so there's a couple of questions I have. The first is there something to be learned about the actual doors and how they enter into what the relationship is between eating, for instance, what the rooms would be like of the wealthy versus the poor? So quite literally what the doorway. And the second question is almost exactly the opposite, which is are the problems of translation around the whole question of thresholds between Latin and Arabic and Aramaic and Hebrew? In other words, that there's a very, very rich language, I know, in Roman law around the threshold. There are actually a whole range of rituals in Roman law around how thresholds get negotiated. And I'm just wondering whether there's anything linguistic there that would be interesting as you look across the Haggadah as it moves across this landscape that you've actually shown over time.
Thank you. Both excellent questions. In terms of what this might suggest about the actual architecture of elite homes, for instance, we know actually very little about what homes likely looked like in Iraq during late antiquity, in part because many of them were mud brick and they're built on two rivers that tend to waver quite a bit and therefore erase essentially everything in their way. That said, from the stories themselves, it suggests that doors, there were many doors in wealthy homes. There are clearly servants, many servants. So we're at least thinking of a multi-chambered house, and the threshold would fit within that picture. Beyond that, I honestly don't know. I've tried to, part of what was interesting about the Penn dig in Nippur, where they discovered the Incantation Bowls, is that the original archaeologists classified it as a Jewish settlement. This would be the only Jewish settlement found in late antique Babylonia. The problem is we also find Syriac and Mandaic bowls there. So at the very least, it's a mixed neighborhood. So think back to Rav Matitya's point about demographic shifts. At the very least, we see that there are coexisting communities there. I have never seen anybody actually try to understand whether the archaeologists did in fact intend very seriously that connotation of it as a Jewish neighborhood. I wanted to investigate the archives, the minutes of the archaeologists that we have in the Penn Museum, but then COVID hit. So I haven't yet, I've made an appointment and everything, and I haven't yet been able to read through the 1863 and on dig seasons reports. So I think we might be able to learn a lot about how these communities were configured, what a house might have looked like if I were able to read, I mean, I hope, but thus far, I haven't been able to produce anything. Remind me the language question. I don't think other languages other than Hebrew and Aramaic are playing a role in the transmission of this. What I do think is happening is in some ways the opposite, which is this is kind of a floating signifier in that the door is actually not terribly marked in Jewish ritual. I'm sure some people here, there are plenty of experts here who will say that there are some ways in which they are marked. You know, there is a mezuzah on the door, so you have your kind of amulet at the door at every Jewish home to this day. But it's not actually terribly marked in terms of festivals and other rituals. And I think that's largely, I think it's a very confusing thing. We now take it for granted precisely because it's part of Passover ritual, but it's not terribly marked. And I assume that it wasn't terribly marked in the medieval period. And that's why they're kind of all quite confused and able to relocate it without any real problem. So I think it's not the fact that it's overly marked. I think it's undermarked and therefore free to kind of float around.
We have a question from Susan Garfinkel. Susan
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, no video today. I have bandwidth issues, but and Penn alum here. I'm so glad I'm able to zoom in for these sessions this semester. I am a practicing Jew who is not a specialist in this area, but I want to ask a question that's sort of towards the material text. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the evolution of the Haggadah, or the changes in the Haggadah as a physical document over time, or publication. Because what strikes me as a practicing Jew who hasn't studied this background, which I'm finding fascinating, is that it is certainly in contemporary Judaism, or at least for contemporary Judaism that's not so orthodox that I don't know about it, it is the only kind of really ritual text that makes it into the home environment at all. And in addition, it's decorated in a way that is very unlike the continued, very traditional, exacting way that something like the Torah continues to be created for worship in the synagogue, or even prayer books, but the explosion of illumination and color and all those things, it seems to me that they're coming around at the same time that you mentioned the change of the placement of the cup, the ritual of the cup in the Haggadah. And I don't know if that has to do with people moving into Europe or whatever, but even for those who are not specialists in this area, if you could just say more about the physical documents and how those change at the same time that the text might be changing, that would be quite interesting.
Thank you. It's a great question. I should say that this is the book history angle on the Haggadah has been explored by people like Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi on the one hand, and by many, many others. I should also note we have some book history people here like Josh Toplitsky, Arthur Quiron, David Ruderman, of course, could speak to all these issues far better than I can. Talia could as well, I'm sure. I would recommend Yerushalmi's Haggadah and History, I believe the book is called. There's also a more popular book that just came out, I think a year ago, which covers a lot of this ground. Very, very briefly, what I'd say is in the early medieval period, those manuscripts that I showed from the Cairo Geniza, those seem to have been personal use items. These are kind of reference tools, maybe, speedily, hastily written. Often, they often have typos or scribal errors. They seem to have been used kind of for personal use of some sort. And then we all of a sudden around the 11th, 12th century have an explosion of illuminated Haggadot, which becomes a kind of practice in its own right, and also a prestige item. And they're culturally inflected depending on which region they're from and who we actually know quite a bit about a number of the illuminators from various regions and so on. By around the 16th or 17th century, well, really with the printing press and then on, mass-produced Haggadot begin to shift the way in which Jews use the Haggadah. So illuminated Haggadots are prestige items that they're big, they're cumbersome. You wouldn't use them at your Passover Seder. You would not sit with a Haggadah, an illuminated Haggadah, and read from it. Oftentimes we know this because you have pages in which there are just beautiful illuminations and then script, right? If you're leading the Passover Seder, it would be a very onerous way of trying to lead the Seder. With the printing press, we all of a sudden have mass-produced Haggadot, eventually leading to the Maxwell House Haggadah in the 20th century. And this will now make it that everybody should have their own Haggadot for their own individual private use and recite from it. We even know this because as we see these kind of printed press Haggadot, they start including not illuminations, but block print, wood block print, bronze block print, and so on, in which they start depicting families using the Haggadot, men and women using the Haggadot, and so on. So it's quite clear that as they become mass produced, then everyone also reads from the Haggadah in their own way. Nowadays, I think many, I don't want to speak for all Jews, of course, but many will kind of go around the table and everybody will read. And this is quite distinct from the practice which likely occurred in antiquity through the Middle Ages, where you probably had a leader of the Seder who more or less read and recited most of it because he knew it by heart. So there is definitely a correlation between the changing materiality of the Haggadah and the way in which Jews are using it. I don't think the text is necessarily shifting as much based on the fact that it's becoming illuminated, or it's becoming illuminated because of how the text is being used. I think that's somewhat of a different issue. But again, there are much more expert people than I am, and they've written very, very good works on this. So I encourage you to get either Vanessa Ox or Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book.
Okay, and we have a question from is it Myra Chang?
Yeah, it's Meira.
Myra, okay, thank you.
I just had one small comment on your fascinating talk, and that was that in one of the passages of the Talmud that you cited, there's an image of people going up to the rooftops to make their invitation from there. And I'm familiar with the image of people going up to the rooftop and to set up ritual altars there from the prophet Yechezkel, where this image seems to be related to other ritual complexes and not Pesach at all. So perhaps Sukkot or even Avodah Zarah. So if it could be possibly tied to Sukkot, then one can understand where some of the imagery regarding like invitations to the poor could come from, like because the whole definition of Sukkot is the invitation of guests. So I'm wondering if it's possible that there was some kind of conflation of the two ritual complexes of Pesach and Sukkot. This is just an idea that I had in listening to your talk. So,
the text of them going to the rooftop was not in the Talmud, it was in the Incantation Bowls. And it seems that that's out of necessity because you do not want to open your door when there are scary demons sitting outside and invite them in because they would take the opportunity to enter your home. So you have no choice, at least that's how I'm understanding why it is that this is from the rooftop and not from the door, even though the actual invitation is verbatim the same as in the Haggadah. I think what's happening there is you have to issue the invitation to them and imagine them swirling around your home. And so you go up to the rooftop where they can hear it. If you were to open your door, it would lead to bad things. In the Babylonian Talmud itself, I should note, because I had to unfortunately I had to look through every single roof and rooftop related text in the Babylonian Talmud to try to see if there was a connection. And almost always in the Babylonian Talmud, I'm afraid to say, when you go up to the rooftop, it's because you intend to jump off it. So that's really the signification of, in the Talmud, you go up to the roof and typically commit suicide. That doesn't seem to be what's happening in the bowls themselves. In terms of Yechezkel or Ezekiel and kind of ancient Babylonian Jewish practices, I don't think there's a connection there, though it's a curious connection.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very odd tension between the Incantation Bowls and the invitation of the poor. I mean, the poor are being equated structurally with the demons, right? So, you know, one can't be sure who you're letting in and whether you know, whether it's a good thing to feed those people knocking at the door or walking through the open door. So it's kind of you're pretending to be rich and you're pretending to be like an enemy of the poor once you pretend to be rich, I guess. So we have a question from John Pollock or further comment.
Jerry, just to quickly respond to that, Jerry, I think it's a really interesting idea that maybe this is actually saying something about how people really feel about the poor who they're supposed to be charitable towards. All I would add to that is, I didn't have time for it here, but actually that incantation, whoever is hungry, come and eat, whoever is thirsty, come and drink, whoever is dry, come and be oiled, anointed. That tripartite incantation already exists in Palestinian Jewish amulets, which are a kind of slightly different genre, but there it is not phrased as an invitation. It simply talks about three types of demons: those who are thirsty, those who are hungry, and those who need to be anointed. Only when it gets to Babylonia is it now formed in this invitational context where they're at the doorway. And so there again, I didn't have time for it, but you really see how the specifically Babylonian social context is even taking internal magical traditions and reapplying them to the current context.
Thank you. John Pollock.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I'm way out of my depth here, so I'm just going to throw something out that of use or not. A little bit following on Liliana's questions, but one of your phrases that I like is that you used a couple times is social script, I think. And this is a textual script as well. I'm just thinking about performance and performative aspects, and you know, in part, you're you're talking about variation, but you're also talking about consistency. So I wonder if you could say something more about, well, I mean, the dramaturgical frame that you're using, I guess, in a meta way, but maybe more historically, this problem of following or varying from a script. I gather would there be rabbinic commentaries on this? I mean, why does Helper 211 not become the dominant? Why don't people just give up that part of the script? It's again, it's a little bit of a variety of what Liliana is asking about. You know, the weight of text, the power of tradition, I guess, and you know, when obviously hypothetically you're talking about change, but also, you know, stabilization. So any thoughts on that, I think might be interesting just in big ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure I have a great answer to the question. I'm going to give a boring answer, and then I'm going to try to make it a bit more complicated. The boring answer is, I think what's happening here is that once someone like a Rav Matitya gets behind it and the Babylonian rabbis get behind it, in time, their authority becomes preeminent such that it becomes very difficult to kind of veer off stream. So Helper 211 reflects actually Palestinian rabbinic tradition, or just Palestinian Jewish tradition, I should say. And over time, and again, I'm going to use a very simplified way of speaking about this that's often used in the field, Palestinian tradition loses out and the Babylonian tradition wins. That's often how we think about this. I think it's a bit more complicated because I don't like monocausal explanations in general. And I think here you have to explain how Rav Matitya's tradition gets us to North Africa. North Africa has particularly close ties with Babylonia. It also has particularly close ties with the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula becomes hugely influential and spreads also, I should also note, North Africa has very close ties with Italy, all this in the 11th century and 12th century. And so part of this is kind of a cascading effect of authority and networks that randomly, chaotically, unpredictably, unless you're looking at it from hindsight, eventually leads to what we have today. So I think at any stage along the way, it could have fallen out. It almost did in Babylonia based on these other Geniza fragments that I found. And simply, you know, the stream happened to work that way. I'm sure there are better explanations. Were we to be able to have better, I mean, I've shown you all the sources that I could muster. I'm sure there are, you know, there are other issues in which you might be able to give a more granular account. I don't think we have the evidence to do that here. So that's the best that I can do, this kind of highly complicated, non-linear process, which ultimately looks quite linear.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because
I should also,
sorry, yeah, this issue of when things can get left out and when they must be kept in and therefore explained in some other fashion. You know, yeah.
Yeah, I have a textual question from somebody who knows the Haggadah only in English. You know, the invitation is in the same English as the rest of the text. Does the Aramaic get translated into Hebrew in some traditions? So does that linguistic difference disappear? And I guess corollary questions, are there translations where that linguistic difference is somehow marked, that oddity of having one sentence in Aramaic in the whole book?
Excellent question. Really interesting. I don't believe in the medieval period it is translated out of Aramaic. That is, it is always marked linguistically as distinct from the primarily Hebrew remainder of the Haggadah. This is because commentators themselves will try to understand why it's in Aramaic. There's an old Jewish idea, and appears in rabbinic literature as well, that the angels know Aramaic. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see some medieval traditions try to explain why it is that this is still rendered in Aramaic. And they'll say, well, it must be for the angels. Mm-hmm. Or it must be for the demons because, you know, you need to use linguistic diversity with demons, which is also a very old idea. So they actually, I think, preserve it. I don't know if any, I wonder, I haven't looked and I should, I wonder if anybody preserves the linguistic difference between Aramaic and Hebrew in their English translation of the Haggadah. I highly doubt it. But it would be fascinating, or I mean, in any rendering, right? In Yiddish, in Judeo-Italian, Ladino, and so on. I do wonder if anyone preserves that kind of a distinction. It's really an interesting question.
Yeah, it seems a failing on the part of the translators. Have a question from Zach.
Well, this really follows up on Jerry's question. I was really interested in the way that particularly in that one recollection of the history of the custom, the way this passage is used to define the boundaries of the Jewish community over against the non-Jewish neighbors. And I wonder, this partly because when I was a kid, this passage was like all about solidarity with non-Jewish people. Anyone can come and eat. The passage itself seems very open. But I wonder if the language, since, correct me if I'm way off here, but Aramaic is a language that's spoken by Jews and non-Jews in the region at that time. So is there anything from the fact of it being in Aramaic that might tell us something about its history or its repurposing, that it might be addressed to a broader, maybe initially addressed to a broader community, or somehow, I don't know, does it matter that it's in Aramaic when we think about the boundaries of the audience?
Thank you. Excellent question. I would say a few things. First of all, in terms of the way you always understood it, I was going to end with a slide of all of the social justice-oriented Jewish communities that have produced Haggadot, with almost invariably have that line, "Whoever is hungry, come and eat," as the title or as the front page or as the image, precisely because they all understand it in that way. So you're not alone. I think it's actually quite a common modern understanding of it. What I think is happening there is Aramaic is used, it was the spoken language. Hebrew probably died out as a spoken language already in first century Palestine, if not earlier, first century Judea, and then eventually Palestine. Seth Schwartz from Columbia University has an excellent article about how this and why this might have happened. It was kind of a prestige language and lost a lot of its flair with the normal people. This is why Jesus probably speaks in Aramaic in the Gospels. It doesn't mean he doesn't know Hebrew, but Aramaic is kind of how you speak. And so it's certainly the case in Babylonia. And I think that's just how, if you want to invite people, doing it in kind of Hebrew would be highly archaic, if not entirely incomprehensible. So you had no choice but to use Aramaic. What I would note is that I think the problem arises that because it's in Aramaic, anybody can understand it, and there is no in-language, in-speak that they can use in a kind of easy, convenient way. Just as a kind of aside, in around the 19th century, 20th century, scholars began to do kind of ethno-linguistic studies of Aramaic-speaking Jewish and Christian communities in the Middle East. A very famous example, what they found was Jews and Christians in the same community seem to have purposely cultivated distinct dialects of Aramaic so that they can actually speak more closely with their far-flung Jewish or Christian neighbors abroad rather than from their contiguous neighboring communities. So it actually seems to have been a cultivated, where the shared Aramaic is actually being used to differentiate communities. That's not what's happening in 7th through 9th century Babylonia, but it is a thing that will happen, so that at some point, maybe in response to your query, they feel the need to actually begin to shift the language itself to accommodate a kind of in-groupness.
Okay. All right, we have a comment in the chat from Sarah Horowitz to everyone, in case you haven't seen. Haverford has a diary from someone on the Nippur dig. It is digitized and available you can read the URL yourselves. Meyer was an architect, not an archaeologist, though. We have questions or comments from Talia Fishman, then Arthur Quiron.
Talia, just before you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention in the book historians, David Stern, who's done quite a lot of work, my predecessor at Penn, who's done quite a lot of work on book history and particularly of the Haggadah. So just wanted to quickly get him in. Sorry, Talia.
A colleague well loved by the material text community. My comment, actually, I'm thinking of Alex Trebek, who would have said, can you please phrase this in the form of a question? I haven't gotten to that stage yet, but it was inspired by what Jerry said. I was struck by the fact that one of Rav Huna's, one of the charitable deeds ascribed to Rav Huna was his hanging of a pitcher, presumably of that medical remedy, on the door so as not to be endangered, which of course sounds perfect for pandemic times, like, here, I'm not touching it, you do it yourself. And that seems to me to have some underlying commonality with the desire to keep the demons at bay. In other words, here, I don't want this pestilence, come and take it and then scram. And so I think there, you can see a commonality that is not all charity and generosity. I mean, there's another, not something that's totally in conflict with it, but it's certainly conditional generosity.
I think that's a very important point. I would say that in the text that you're referring to, which I think is the Rav Huna, the first of the two, first he says to invite people in to eat, and the second thing that he did was put the remedies outside. I think you're probably right that it's because these people were infectious and therefore keep them kind of at arm's length. So yeah, I don't think that it necessarily speaks to kind of the demonic, but that being said, if you remember, I began by saying that some traditional commentators understood the opening formula as a way of fending off demons before the Passover Seder. And this drove me crazy for about a month because I found it in the Incantation Bowls. Now we have medieval commentators who seem to believe that this is actually being used to fend off demons, even in the Haggadah itself. And so I tried to read the whole thing as really originating in kind of ancient Jewish magic. And that's then how it made its way into the Babylonian Talmud and then into the Haggadah. And it doesn't work. I just don't think it actually holds up. I think it's much better to think of it as a kind of an a priori practice that they're each playing with their own way. But I didn't think of the remedy in that. So thank you. I think that's actually an important piece of it. I just don't think it works as a kind of a running thread that connects all of them. But I hear it's a good point that's distinct from the inviting them into the house.
Arthur?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I wanted to ask kind of a historical question. I had a teacher who said that, this is going back to what Zach was saying about boundaries and about the sort of contemporary feeling that the Passover is a universal time when everybody can get together and celebrate, liberation from slavery to freedom. And I guess I was just wondering, because there's a lot of wine being served on Passover, and was there a sense in the Gaonic period that you're looking at when this is getting assimilated into the Haggadah? Is there a sense that you want to keep people out because you're not supposed to drink with non-Jews? Was that so strictly tied to notions of idolatry? But I mean, I don't know, Zoroastrians, or what is what I'd just like to hear more about the boundary implications of your reading.
It also goes back to Natalie's question, I think, about whether there's a way in which what's really happening with the demographic shift is not that you don't want Jews to accidentally end up at the homes of non-Jews, but you don't want non-Jews to accidentally end up at the homes of Jews. I think these are all great questions. I probably need to do more work it's very rare also, which is why it's exciting for the Gaonim to give us such clear descriptions of their realia, like their local realia, primarily because oftentimes their response are aimed outward from Jewish communities, the ones that are preserved because they are preserved by those other communities. Typically the letters that we have, the responses that we have are actually to communities outside of Babylonia, and therefore the kind of internal Babylonian social realities aren't relevant. So I do need to think about it a bit more. All I could say in response is that the other thing the Gaonim seem to mention repeatedly, and they actually begin to change rabbinic law in very crucial ways, is that Jews have left the countryside where they originally lived, and they now live in urban centers like Baghdad, and they've relocated entirely to places like Cairo and North Africa and so on. This is partly how we think this tradition is traveling. That is, we shouldn't think of this as kind of floating disembodied which often that's how we speak of tradition, but it's clearly traveling on the bodies of Babylonian Jews who we can actually trace based on their nisbas, so their Arabic, the names that tell us where they're from, family connections, marriages, and so on. We can actually see how Babylonian Jews and therefore tradition is spreading. We know a little bit about the migration patterns, about demographic shifts, but beyond that, I don't think we know all that much, but I think I need to do a bit more work and look into it. From this period, I should say.
So just I just want to, do we know anything about whether Jews and non-Jews in the early in this period would drink together? It just really contrasts with the Christian, idea of that Christianity might be idolatry, and it's just sort of is. I just was do we know anything about the depth of acceptability of drinking together?
Yeah, so in the Syriac Christian Synod, Church Synod of 586 CE, there amongst the rules that are the canons that are passed, one of them is this kind of really annoyed canon where the ecclesiastical hierarchy writes to their community and says, we are sick and tired on Sundays when after you've drunken the wine and taken the Eucharist, that you go out to Jewish pubs and drink with Jews. You need to stop doing this. This is a terrible, terrible thing, and contradicts the whole point that, of course, these people are, as Syriac Christians call them, crucifiers. That was their kind of nomenclature for Jews, right? So how can you, on the one hand, essentially commemorate the killing of Christ, and on the other hand, then go out and drink with Jews all on the same day? Nowadays, it would be going to church and then watching football. But that's the kind of 586 CE Babylonian equivalent. My guess is it wasn't a terribly effective canon. Typically, I imagine on the ground, there is far more commingling than any of the elite texts would like to admit, even texts like that, which is lambasting certain practices. I think on the whole, we find a lot of commingling. In fact, I would say that the Incantation Bowls are in some ways our best evidence for this in late antique Babylonia, because we find rabbis invoked in Syriac and Mandaic bowls. We find Jesus invoked in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic bowls. We find the same exact formulas copied and pasted even between these different communities, where you can even see that the dialect hasn't shifted back. That is, they're really just copying and pasting Mandaic into Jewish Babylonian Aramaic script, Jewish Babylonian Aramaic into Syriac script. Do we think of these as kind of guilds in which they're all working together, or is this just kind of, people encountering each other? I think we need to do a lot more work to figure it out, but there's certainly a lot of commingling. And in terms of drinking, it's one of the, weirdly, we actually do have very clear evidence that Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians are likely drinking together in this area at this time.
I would just add one last point that according to Lenny Bruce, Jews are Christ killers. He found out because his cousin Morty left a note. Morty said, I did it. So that 586 thing may not be that far off the mark.
I have an archaeological question about the Incantation Bowls. Do the archaeologists think that the ones from the different believing communities were made by the same potters and decorated by the same decorators? I have no way of knowing. Do the archaeologists have a way of knowing?
This is one of the materiality of the bowls is, and also the paleography of the bowls. So both of those things are in terrible need of study. Typically what you, and this is, I think some people are beginning to do this. This is also very helpful because almost all of the bowls that are on the market, around 2,500, if not more, are unprovenanced. If we could begin to actually take the provenance bowls, get some kind of a sample, understand what the local clay looked like, the composition of the local clay, we could probably begin to provenance thousands and thousands of unprovenanced bowls. Mm-hmm. That being said, they're very, very basic ceramic ware. They're basically the size of cereal bowls. They're just, they're numerous, and they pre-exist the period as items, not items with incantations, but the bowls don't look any different from any ceramic bowl. Mm-hmm. My guess is these things are mass produced, and then there's quite a bit of debate about what it looked like. How would you go and hire a scribe to write your bowl? How exactly, so one of the last little wrinkles I'll put in here is about 25% of the bowls are what we call pseudo-script bowls. Actually, I've gone through the entire Penn collection of around 255 specimens. Holds around 25% are pseudo-script bowls, and that is their designs. There's pseudo languages. You see the same scribe who invented a language, which isn't a real language, it's just kind of symbols, and uses it consistently across many bowls, some of which are identical. And some scholars argue that these are charlatans who are attempting to dupe their clients. I think the better explanation, and people, a scholar in Europe has been writing about this, the better explanation is probably that there's some kind of performative aspect to the bowl ceremony. It was implanted in your house by a magician, a sorcerer, a scribe. And as such, you can either get a highly meticulously drawn, inscribed bowl with a beautiful incantation, or you can go to the best performer who might inscribe some things or make it look really pretty, but ultimately what mattered in for those kind of performers was the performance and not the bowl itself. So the answer, just to get back to the composition question, we don't know. My guess is they're using exactly the same bowls, buying it from exactly the same guy, because why not?
Okay, and Zach has a geeky history of the book comment on chat for us all. And we have a question from, forgive me if I mispronounce the last name, Mark Letney, and then followed by a question from Peter Stallybrass.
Excellent, thanks. I have a follow-up archaeological question that you, based on your earlier answer, may not be able to answer, but coming from a very different archaeological context as a Roman archaeologist, one would assume that letting someone into your house does not involve letting them into your dinner party. Do you have any sort of indication of what exactly opening your door means in a sort of a social sense, or even just in a physical sense? Because at least in a Roman home, those two things are not the same.
You're right that I don't have the answer to it, but it's actually very interesting because the Talmudic texts and the Aramaic Incantation Bowls seem to imply that what's happening when the doors are open is you'd come and pick up goods, as opposed to come and sit down and eat and hang out. So maybe you're right that actually what's imagined, even in the kind of the earliest versions of this in the Passover Haggadah, is that you're simply inviting them to eat. That is to partake of some goods, not to sit and join you at your meal. I'll have to think about that more. It's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, and a comment from Catherine Hallerstein about my question about the Hebrew Aramaic. For all to see is I don't think the lack of distinction between the Aramaic lines and the Hebrew and translations of the Haggadah is a failure. In Ashkenaz, Lashon Kodesh, the sacred tongue of Hebrew Aramaic, is more or less perceived as a single entity. Earlier, Michael Karasik had a comment that was pulling in maybe different direction, which is, of course, they're different, and everybody would know that they're different. So I'll let the two of you duke that out. I'm wondering if on those notes we might want to call it a day, but I'm open for any more questions. That I don't see any raised hands, so I think I will take the opportunity to really thank Simcha for really a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I thank everybody who is here for really engaged discussion, and hope to see many of you in the coming weeks. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.